Does damage to a windscreen make it weaker? If so, by how much? We asked the world's leading independent experts, who found that damaged glass can be less than half as strong as undamaged glass. And not only is damaged glass weaker, but everyday stresses have a big influence. How do we know? Well, we use the same technology as NASA. The space shuttle's windshields cost $50,000 each. Every second in space, millions of micrometeoroids hit the shuttle's window and made a little chip. If one of these chips had grown and cracked the windshield in orbit or on re-entry, the result could have been disaster. So NASA inspected windshields under polarized light. They found that a little chip focuses the stress acting on the entire windscreen. See the lighter areas at the ends? That's stress. This view compares normal and polarized light. The red and yellow areas are high stress concentrations, and they're why a windscreen cracks when added stress exceeds its instant failure strength. How do you add stress to a windscreen? Heat it, cool it, drive it. Let's heat a cold chip windscreen and see what happens. Elapsed time, less than 5 minutes. Now let's cool a hot screen. And now let's simply drive. But those were extremes. What about ordinary everyday conditions? Let's look now what happens to glass when you don't heat it, cool it, or drive it. Almost everything corrodes. And whether we call the process oxidization, rust, or rot, it all happens at the molecular level. Air and water react with the molecules in the metal to combine and make new molecules that are something other than pure metal. In effect, the metal is eaten away until eventually it disappears altogether. Not such a great outcome if you're building a skyscraper, a ship, or a car.
That's why entire industries dedicate themselves to studying and preventing materials corrosion, cheating natural chemistry, if you like, to stop or slow down the process of decay. It's also why Belron spends more than any other glass specialist on mastering the science of glass and glass breakage. Some of you may recall Best of Belron 2010, where we shared some of our work with world-leading scientists.
Most people have heard of metal fatigue. It was first identified in 1842 when a train from Versailles to Paris crashed and one of its axles failed due to many small strays instead of one large one. A more famous example was in 1954, when 3 De Havilland Comet jet airliners fell out in the sky in the same year. And in 2005, Flight 101 from Miami to the Bahamas lost an anti-wind due to the repeated small stresses acting on a tiny crack in the metal. In our laboratory, we have been recently working to find out how the same effects operate in glasses. Although laminated glass has a different molecular structure to metal, a similar effect to metal fatigue can be seen. Look down a microscope with me at this animation of the leg of a ship. We can see individual glass molecules and the bones at the tip of the microcrack. As we subject the glass to repeated small stresses, each one much less than would be required to cause an instant failure. The bond between two molecules fails, putting more stress on the next molecule bond. Little by little, molecule by molecule, the ship grows. Even in ordinary driving and subject to quite normal temperatures, accumulated stress will cause failure. Here is the same thing in a real test. We apply a stress continuously to a shaped sample until it cracked. At no time was the glass subjected to anything like its instant failure load, but little by little the chip grew and the glass cracked. Our research shows that a little chip will become a crack when the fatigue stress reaches a certain threshold value.
That was 2010. We have done more work since then with other experts, in particular at Aachen University with Professor Reinhard Konrad, a leading expert in the field of glass corrosion. Yes, glass corrosion. Perhaps you talk us through your work, Professor Konrad.
Thanks, Chris. Hello, everybody. My name is Reinhard Konrad. I have been a professor at Aachen University in Germany for the past 14 years. My field of expertise is the science and technology of glass. Glass is a fascinating material. It is transparent and extremely rigid. It can be formed into any conceivable shape, such as endless sheets, ribbons, tubes or fibers. Theoretically, glass has an extremely high strength. We make use of this property in making glass fiber reinforced composite materials used in constructing boats or blades of wind turbines. Most people would, however, doubt that glass is a strong material because they know that it may break easily. Yes, unfortunately, glass is not very resistant to fracture. And we see in everyday glass products, such as windscreens, that the failure strength is much lower than the theoretical value. When doing my chemistry experiments as a student, I also believed, like most people do, that glass did not corrode. But in my first work assignment, after my PhD, about 30 years ago, I was to study the corrosion of glass. And I have developed a lifelong passion for this topic. I found it is true. Glass does corrode, especially when exposed to water and stress. It's a fascinating molecular process, but difficult to explain simply. So, now I wonder if you would mind joining me at the very end of a windscreen chip? We are at the very end of one of the veins of a glass chip. To either side of you are the edges of the chip. Right in front is the tip of the chip, the furthest extent of the splitting apart that took place in the instant the stone hit the screen. If you recall what you saw earlier, the place where much of the whole windscreen stress is concentrated. Although this looks like an alien world, its atmosphere is exactly the same as the one you are breathing now. If we were all very tiny, we could happily live down here, because there's oxygen and moisture present, just like at the surface. Unfortunately, that fact will cause us trouble from now on. It is due to the combination of corrosion and stress, and it happens when glass is brought into contact with water, H2O. Glass is made up of silicon atoms linked to their neighbors by oxygen bridges. When a hydrogen ion from the water jumps across and joins an oxygen bridge, hydroxide is formed, separating two silicon atoms. The lock in front of the crack tip is broken. Molecules are torn apart by the stress, and the crack grows a tiny little bit, just like a zip. Of course, losing just one molecular bridge of glass in a windscreen isn't such a problem, but it's never just one bridge you lose. This process happens inevitably, inexorably, all around us in the chip, when there's any level of humidity in the air, even just 2%, as you'd find in the desert. That is what corrosion in combination with stress does to the windscreen. It weakens it from the inside, allowing the chip to grow bigger and bigger and bigger until it takes less and less stress to destroy the whole thing.
Because every windscreen is always subject to minute amounts of stress, this process will happen even if you never go near a hot place, a cold place, or a bumpy road. Molecule by molecule, it goes on all the time, making a chip bigger, second by second, until the screen is so weakened it needs hardly any force to make it crack. The more humidity there is in the air, the faster it happens. And if you do also apply force to the chip by driving or enduring temperature changes, well, your windscreen survival time could be measured in hours or days. So what can Belrun do to stop this damage growth for good? Come back into the chip and I'll show you.
Now the RAS 123 is put in place. The RAS is able to create a vacuum and high pressure in the brake. Vacuum now. No air at all in the chip. Now pressure, as the resin is forced in at 4 atmospheres. The brake is filled, and the resin is cured with ultraviolet light. The repair is complete. The windscreen will never crack from this chip. And we have saved energy, waste, time, glass, and money compared to the replacement that, eventually, would have been required.